This is Sam Long.
I'm John Nugent.
And I am Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
After class.
Thanks for joining us. Another episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. This is an exciting podcast for us here in the Great Lakes family.
Oh,
because
the excitement is just like bubbling over.
palpable,
Oh
if
my
you
God.
will. We have the great pleasure of bringing on one of our colleagues, one of our newer colleagues, to some of you perhaps, to join us for a little series we got started. And that person is Todd Jones. Say hello, Todd.
Hey, happy to be here.
No, hello, Todd.
Hello, Todd.
There you go.
Already is screwed up.
Man, we're off to a great start on this.
Yeah, we're doing something a little different. We've brought in guests before we've spotlighted something they wrote. Last week we interviewed Frank Viola, and this one's going to be different in that we're actually asking our guests to lead the series.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And so this is unique. We're doing a series on spiritual disciplines. This has been requested of us.
Yes, multiple times in different ways.
And as we were talking, Sam, Ron, and I were talking about that series, who would lead it? Who's got material on this? And it's just like, well.
And we're all like, we don't do spiritual discipline, so we wouldn't know anything about it.
I'm the most undisciplined person you're going to meet, so I am not qualified to lead.
Yeah, but we do have a class at Great Lakes, a required class called Christian Faith, which is a spin-off from a class that used to be called Personal Spiritual Formation. And Todd Jones is teaching this class. And it just so happens that he teaches through the spiritual disciplines. And we're like, hey, let's invite Todd on to do a lot of the work for us.
Yeah.
And as a bit of a test, like to see if, that doesn't matter.
Well, I definitely appreciate that explanation, because as soon as you invite somebody in to talk about spiritual disciplines, there's an implication that they're like some kind of expert. It's like, we need somebody to talk about humility. Let's bring in the humility expert. Like, nobody wins in that situation. I do teach this content in class. I wouldn't claim to be the best, most spiritually disciplined person among us, but this is an opportunity for me to share some of my stuff.
Have you done the disciplines?
I have at least tried them all.
Well, then you're better prepared.
You're way
than we
ahead
are.
of us.
Way ahead of us. I can't remember last time I prayed or fasted.
Oh my gosh, Ron. It's funny because it's true.
We laugh because it's funny. We laugh because it's true.
But like our normal episodes, it's not just, we're not here to listen to Todd present his course material. Like he already has prepared material. He's going to kick the topic off, help orient us a little bit, and we'll do our normal banter around the table.
Followed by mockery of Ron. That's the,
People expect that. If
Okay.
you didn't mock me, people would think they were listening to the wrong
there you go.
podcast.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us what you're going to use as the guide to kind of frame this conversation?
Sure, yeah, we've kind of got an oldie but a goodie. Richard Foster wrote a book called Celebration of Discipline that's approaching 40 years old, I think, at
Crazy.
this point,
That is
which is wild. I mean, I've used this book for a very long time. I've led church groups through it. I've used it as a student at Great Lakes a number of years ago that I won't name, and this book just continues to hold up. I can't find anybody else who has done the disciplines in such a practical, straightforward way. Foster's categorization method for the disciplines makes a lot of sense to me. So that's where we're sort of drawing our outline from, and he makes contributions to suggest how these disciplines ought to be done and suggest definitions for what they are even, and we're going to kind of launch pad off that and then do the after class thing and talk about what the Bible says, talk about the experiences of these guys, and yeah, Foster will provide an outline, but we're going to kind of make it our own, I think, along the way.
So we're assuming you've listened to enough of our episodes that you know the after class style. Is that a safe assumption?
That is a safe assumption. I won't tell you that I've listened to every single episode. I'll just imply it through the negative not mentioning it thing, but I have listened to every single episode, yeah. Actually, really quick, I've got to jump in and say something really quick. I actually started listening to the After Class podcast during COVID because I, like many people, was lonely during that time because I had just moved to Kansas 2 months before COVID shutdowns happened, didn't hardly know anybody in Kansas yet. And I started listening to the podcast because I wanted to hear familiar voices. And it was like, oh, my old friends and all that. And then I went, this is incredible. And it's actually been deeply impactful in my formation, my education, my spiritual life. And so truly, I know that you all are not super sentimental in this way, but like this is a really big moment for me to be able to contribute in any way back to a podcast that's given me a lot. And I'm glad to be here. We can move on from that now, lest we make Sam uncomfortable with the emotional stuff.
Well, I mean,
I don't
do
get
you need
uncomfortable. It
Kleenex?
just doesn't affect
Do you
me.
need Kleenex?
No, yeah, please.
His tears are streaming down your face.
Glasses are getting a little foggy.
Robot oil dripping out.
Well, it's probably worth mentioning that the podcast had something to do with you getting hired, right?
Yeah,
Didn't we?
yeah,
Wasn't it
That's true.
around the table in that room next door,
Yeah.
which is now Todd's office, while we
be
were
mine.
gathering together, someone somewhere told us that Todd had reached out to us.
Oh, I don't remember that conversation. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not recollecting that conversation, but it makes sense.
It was me.
Okay.
Yeah, we because Todd was teaching online for me, and we'd had some
Oh, that's
conversations,
right. Now I-
and you know, he was downing himself. I said, no, you definitely have the possibility, and so anyway, yeah, so we brought it up.
Did you hear about the job lead through the podcast? Is that what happened?
That is what happened.
Okay. I knew there was a concrete connection.
Yes,
Yeah.
I was on my way to visit a church member who had an experience as a pastoral visit, and I was listening to the podcast on the way. In the intro, the job posting was being announced on the podcast. I literally pulled the car over and drafted a message to the after class Facebook group, which I now realize that's not a monitored channel that you all communicate through.
Nope.
But I said, hey, after you hire after the person you hire for this retires in 15 years, I'm your guy. You should definitely look at me for this job. And then somebody said, maybe now. And so I applied. You know, I didn't have any expectations, but now here we are.
Well, and I think it's a really great story because John and I remember having you as a student, many years ago. And we've been able to watch the transition from student to friend and colleague to coworker. And you're not the first, but you're one of the most recent people that we've been able to experience that with. And I love that. I love that we can have those kinds of relationships that, number one, continue for many, many years, but to be able to transition into that coworker thing. And that's why it's cool to have you on the podcast, because we've been able to watch your growth, and you are more than qualified to be a part of this conversation. So it's great. Welcome.
Well, thank
All
you.
right, the floor is now yours.
Okay.
Sam's all dried up.
yeah.
Everything's good.
I've cleaned off my mascara. I'm ready to go.
See through his glasses now.
Well, this is not necessarily the typical way to begin with all of the disciplines, but what I found is that meditation, the first discipline that we're going to be approaching, has so many preconceived notions wrapped up into it that the best way to start is by talking about what it's not. Everybody comes in with some understanding of what meditation is that usually revolves around the sound om and
Yes.
some sort of gesture with your
Right.
fingers and that sort of stuff. And so
Legs crossed.
And like,
Lotus
don't
position.
you like hit a
Have the little
singing
gong or
bowl.
something.
Anya playing in the background.
Enya?
I've heard it both ways.
No, you haven't. No one's heard it. Anya.
I really hope you're
Stop
not
it.
mocking Enya, because I was just listening to her yesterday.
I was
and
you?
the day before.
And last week's podcast, actually. It doesn't matter. It's Enya. It's not Anya. That's fine.
I was getting quiet over here because I also listen to some Anya when I'm studying. But anyway,
Did we hear what he just said? Anya. Yeah, both
I
ways.
split the middle. I went right for the middle.
Ianya.
I'm not going to weigh in on the
Don't make
proper
me
pronunciation.
choose.
So. It's an E. It's Enya.
Well, so on that note, Foster has just this amazing quote in this chapter that I love, and I always put it up on the screen, and it makes a positive first impression with students and all that. He leads off meditation by saying, meditation is not an esoteric flight into the cosmic consciousness. And then I make students define what the word esoteric means, and we talk about this principle. This is the preconceived notion that I think many people have. Meditation is not an esoteric flight into the cosmic consciousness. So I guess I'll pose the question to you all. What do you hear when you hear that, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think about like just kind of trying to be one with the world and just putting yourself kind of on a different plane so that like everything is in order, which is on the everything in order is a biblical concept. The putting yourself in a different plane is not. And so it's like, but if I can just like get rid of everything else, finally I'll be ready to like connect, like plug into the universe when normally I'm not.
Well, and it takes me back in time. And this is
Your hippie
dating
days.
well, not my hippie days, but I'm dating myself because it makes like the Beatles and George Harrison and going, and sitting at the feet of these great sort of Hindu thinkers, teaching them to meditate. And the big thing is just to clear your mind of everything. If you want to meditate, you got to get everything out of your mind and empty it in some way, so that then you can do what you were just talking about, Sam. You want to get into contact with this great cosmic consciousness. And I do think that for a lot of Christians, when they hear the word meditate, that's immediately what they default to. And that's why I think they push back against it, because like, oh, we know what meditation is. It's this horrible thing that all these weird cult groups do, and we don't want to get involved in that. And I think what you're saying, Todd, is really good, because so often we assume that we know the word, what a word means, whether we're studying the Bible or anything else. And when we see it, we bring all that baggage of that definition with it. And we don't take time to allow the Bible to create a new definition for us. And so I think it's important for us to say, when you hear meditation, don't assume that it's something you're going to do in your yoga class or something like that. But there is a different form of meditation that the Bible definitely encourages us to embrace.
Yeah, when I hear the word, I've never done a study of meditation. So this is one of those practices, like a lot of Bible church practices, I've done extensive study. This one I'm pretty much a blank slate. And so in my head, I had just have two definitions of meditate. And one is kind of what you guys have been talking about, this disconnect from the noise around you, right? And kind of this Far Eastern kind of religious trance-like experience, which I think is what his definition. And the other connotation it has is kind of the opposite. It's like focus on one thing extensively. Like that to me, it's either like you meditate on it, like you focus on it extensively, or you're just emptying yourself and focusing on nothing to create space for some kind of revelation or something like that.
Yeah, and I went through the book forever ago as well, and one of the things that has stuck with me the entire time is how he makes the distinction between like Eastern meditation, which is that emptying of the mind, and what the Bible talks about, which we'll probably get to at some point, and like, oh, okay, so it's not about just getting everything out of your mind. You need to fill it with something, because just emptying it and getting one with nature is not what the Bible is talking about. And that's always stuck with me, what he talks about, that idea, that very clear distinction between what we'd call Eastern meditation and, well, Western.
Sure, yeah, and I think that distinction holds up for our purposes in a lot of ways. I mean, not least of which is the Eastern bias against individualism. And it's not that we want to wholesale adopt a Western perspective on individualism and say effectively the individual is a lowercase g God and that's the highest good or something like that. But based on that bias against individualism, the Eastern faiths are biased towards the disillusion of our individuality. And meditation ends up becoming a pathway to empty yourself of everything that makes you you, so that you can either sort of rejoin with the divine Brahma or the universe or whatever version that takes. Becoming less you so that you can become less anything is actually the goal. And in Christian meditation, perhaps one of the most important distinctions we can make is meditation is about you becoming more you. That is the you that God made you to be, and the goodness that is you, that God has bestowed you with and instilled you with. This is kind of reminds me of the angsty teen in high school that's like, if I never expect anything, then I'll never be disappointed. Right?
That's my mantra.
And some of us
You're
grew
still
up.
an angsty teen.
Maybe.
I see you in a whole new life now, Sam.
We actually talked about that in class the other day. They're like, you don't expect anything of us? Not really. And when you do something better, I feel good about that.
But if that I refuse to expect anything is rooted in my expectations are the problem. And if I can stop expecting anything and really stop existing and stop being an individual, then all peace will be achieved, because there won't be anything to be in conflict. And the Christian vision of peace is not that people would stop being themselves. The Christian vision of peace is that we would embrace those things which are different about each other as strengths rather than as weaknesses. And so, yeah, I think you've touched on a really important point that Foster develops well in the chapter.
Interesting. Yeah. Everything you're describing reminds me of Romanticism, which is actually a early kind of pre-modern, a transitionary phase in philosophy and in art and culture, where it's a lot of this becoming one with the cosmic consciousness, right? And during Romantic theology, like Friedrich Schleiermacher, is kind of all about, your individuality matters as it is a part of a cosmic whole. And your self kind of gets absorbed and disappears into that whole interconnectedness of it all. So has me curious in whether there was some kind of influence from the Far East that kind of made its way to Europe and then became a feature of Western thought for a hot second.
I mean, we talk about globalization like it's a new phenomenon, and based on the technical definition of that word, what we're talking about is a new phenomenon, the advent of the internet and global travel and all of that. But certainly the Enlightenment and the Renaissance periods were in part brought about by increased exposure, and part of that was increased exposure to classical Greek thought. And we see that, you know, in all the Aristotelian influence and all that shows up during that period of time. But also, I think it would be fair to say that a person who could never have conceivably ever met a Buddhist or somebody practicing some sort of Eastern version of the faith is now meeting them, or at least getting exposed to their ideas. The possibility that you could send a letter across the planet, that's about the time, the era that dates to, and that makes sense to me.
Interesting. As you were.
As you were.
Continue.
Sure. Well, another thing, we need to move through the is not fairly quickly so that we actually leave time for what it is. So we kind of squeeze two together there, which is helpful. Another thing that meditation is not, and I really emphasize this with the students, it is not manifesting reality. It is not manifesting reality. That is, it's not some kind of a name it, claim it philosophy. It's not the old I think I can kind of mind over matter approach. Meditation is not a way to make things happen by thinking them into being.
It's almost like the Force in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. Or some kind of sympathetic magic where, you know, if we just input the right combination of words or codes or whatever, then we'll get some sort of output. Meditation is absolutely not that.
Yeah. And I've seen plenty of that in churches where I've served in the past, where that's exactly what you're taught to do. It is that name it and claim it. And it's at the role of positive thinking and all that. And that's a very pop culture kind of thing. And it was really big in the 20th century, early 21st century. I think it's still around. I think more people are beginning to realize its shortcomings. But there are still places where you see that dominating the conversation. And I think you're right that we want to push back against that a little bit to say, no, this is not what real biblical meditation is. And it comes back to what we said earlier. People assume that whatever definition they're using, that must be what the Bible says, instead of really examining whether or not that's what's actually happening.
Is Yoda an example of this? You know, I think of Luke in the swamp, like doing a handstand with one hand, and you know, like, and Yoda's on his feet or something like that, right? And he's focusing and trying to access the Force, and then manifest the ship lifting from the swamp. Is this what you're talking about? The name it? Is this that trajectory of thought?
Yeah, something like that. And partially that power of positive thinking influence that really crept in during that kind of self-betterment era, right? That there's a lot of overlap between what self-betterment or self-improvement was doing and then what Christians sort of adopted and picked up and said, we can do this the God way. Meditation shouldn't be co-opted to become something like Luke training to go fight Darth Vader. That's not what meditation is, but it is training. So we don't want to lose that element. It is absolutely a discipline in the sense that these are all disciplines. And maybe we could have started here, I guess, but a discipline as a kind of a basic definition, doing something that you don't particularly want to do for some greater goal, right? Some broader objective that lies beyond the choice that you're making to do something that doesn't come naturally. And meditation may not come naturally to most, if any of us. And part of that paradigm of it not coming naturally is what makes it beneficial. So on the one hand, Luke is doing exactly what we're talking about in that he's doing something that doesn't come naturally so that he might cultivate something in himself. But that manifesting reality that says, if I just work hard enough, I will achieve or produce said output, accomplish this goal, make this thing happen, visualize the win, that sort of stuff. That's not the territory that we're living in.
Yeah. Well, I would say, to touch on what you were just saying there, of all the things that are listed as spiritual disciplines, this is the one that is not a discipline for me because I do it so naturally. Like, this is my world. Meditation is Ron. When I get frustrated, when I get stressed, is when I can't meditate because it's just so organic to who I am. I think that's one of the reasons I like solitude. You know, I'm out working on the farm, working on the garden, or driving the tractor. I'm turning things over in my head. I'm doing all this kind of stuff. And it's just glorious. I love living in that world. But you said something really interesting, and it really piqued my curiosity to say, if it's something that you do, then is it really a discipline? I think that's a good question to ask. You know, am I doing a discipline that doesn't require any discipline on my part?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think
Can I just, yes.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, Paul says training the body is of some value, but, the spiritual things matter more. That's the Todd paraphrase. You're welcome. Get used to that.
That's right on.
Well done. Good message version of that.
Oh, ooh, ouch. That burned. The fact that it comes naturally doesn't mean that there's not an expression of discipline happening in it. Like some people, against what I believe is human nature and basic human existence, enjoy running. I don't understand why they do. It's very strange to me, but they do. And so if they run, they're experiencing the benefits from running, even if they enjoy it. If I go and run, the benefits are the same. I don't want to, but if I discipline myself to go and run, I will get those benefits too. So it's almost like the act of doing it is innately useful. It does not have to be self-flagellation or some uphill battle where I'm demanding something of myself that's so unnatural that I just hate it the whole time. That's sometimes how we think about like sports training or like leg day in the gym, so that sort of stereotype. If it comes naturally, great. That might mean that you'll have other ways that you need to grow in the other disciplines. And then this one, it's not like it's on lock, like you never have to think about it again, but it ends up becoming kind of a home base. You default back to when, particularly if you're trying and struggling in another area of discipline, this is a comfort zone for you. And I suspect by the time we get toward the end of this, we'll all have identified one or even more of those comfort zone disciplines that we enjoy and come naturally to us, but it's not we're not benefiting because we're not suffering.
Well, and I think along that lines too, that everybody has things where they're naturally gifted. You use the analogy of people who are just naturally athletic. It just seems like it comes really easy to them. Well, where they can really fall into the trap is to assume that all they have to rely on is their natural ability. But most great athletes, they have that natural ability that has been enhanced through discipline. And so for somebody like me, for whom meditation is just second nature, it doesn't mean I'm perfect at it, that I can take a natural ability, but learn how to enhance it by disciplining myself even more. And so I don't want anybody to assume that just because it comes naturally to them that I'm good now. There's always ways to improve even the things that we do very naturally.
Yeah, I need to get a positive definition out here because I don't know. I heard you say meditation is wrong, but I haven't heard what meditation is yet.
I heard that it's wrong. That's it. Podcast over.
Well, yeah, but if they don't know me, then I have no idea.
Yeah, it's time. Let's do this. Let's throw out Foster's definition first. I'm actually going to hit you with a couple right in a row because, again, in the interest of time, and then also hopefully this composite will create kind of a word picture, and then we can bat it around and talk about it. Foster's definition is Christian meditation is the ability to hear God's voice and obey God's word. My definition of meditation, and again, I'm aiming this at college freshmen who think meditation is something hard to do. My definition is meditation is choosing to think. Just choosing to think. Another definition, meditation is saying no to other things so that you can prioritize thinking. And lastly, meditation is a way to reach deep into the self and get past the surface.
So the keys are it's thinking, according to Foster, it's hearing, and then, of course, obeying as a result of that. So it's about formation, right? It's about spiritual formation on some level where we're taking something in, we're considering it, and then ideally that thing that we consider then changes us. Yeah?
I don't know if I want to jump back in and agree with you too quickly. I want everybody to have a chance to say, but yeah, I mean, that's Foster's. We're not emptying ourselves; we're being filled up. That's right. his commitment. And so these definitions could state that more explicitly, but that's where he's trying to go, and that's where I think we ultimately need to land. Is meditation is about filling ourselves up and experiencing some benefit, not becoming less or becoming not us.
Okay,
that helped, John.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me it's. This word, like who gets to define it?
Sure.
Ron.
Duh.
Like it's not one of those things where there's a huge amount of biblical material.
Right.
Like often words have meanings and functions in our culture, and then we go to the scriptures and we see how it's used, and it's like, oh wow, something slightly different is coming out of here. And I think we do have some biblical material to work with that probably goes in the direction Foster's thinking about. He kind of said it awfully definitive. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's my, this is an aside. That's my critique of Foster's book in general. A lot of great material, but it's a lot of, this is it. And like, is it completely? that's my critique of the book, but he has a lot of great stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm willing to take this definition for a ride and say, for the purposes of his book or for this conversation, let's use this definition. But like, if I agree with it, like on what sense would I agree with it? On what basis would I agree with it? Is there a standard above that we can appeal to, right? To adjudicate different theories of what meditation is. I'm curious to hear about the biblical material and whether that pushes us in that direction in a way that kind of buttresses his definition, or what Ron is the incarnation of, or your more
See, the mocking of Ron has
focused,
already begun.
your more focused definition, which I find equally interesting. Yeah.
Sure. We do have a couple passages. Since Ron kind of already weighed in on this, sorry to just blast right past your chance to say something, Ron, but
I've said a lot already, so it's no problem.
oh, it's quite yeah. So we've got a couple examples of things to meditate on that show up in the Psalms that I think are relevant here, and then we've also got some instructions that are given at a pretty crucial moment in the people of God's life and history as they're getting ready to cross into the Promised Land and that whole setting. Let's start with the Psalms first. So we first look at Psalm 145:5. And I think I've got the NRSV UE here. This is Psalm 145:5. They will recount the glorious splendor of your majesty, and on your wondrous works I will meditate.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I looked up the Hebrew to know what word is being translated meditate.
Nerd, go on.
Yeah, it's fine. Hebrew nerd. Siach is the word, but it's not used very often. It has to do with, there's multiple definitions. The first is complain, I found fascinating. But then meditate is after that. And so he's not complaining about God's works, but the idea is you're definitely interacting, right? You're
Dwelling on
thinking-
it.
Yeah,
Like,
you're-
complainers just keep going after it, right? They keep
Right.
whining and complaining. There's a repetition to it. Is that why you think it kind of comes out of the
I
same
think
word?
Perhaps something like that, because because like you say, complainers don't just give their complaint and they're done. They harp on it until something changes. And,
Right.
that's not a terrible idea for meditation, harping on
Harping on
something until you
something.
change.
Ooh, that's good. Write that down, someone.
Harping on yourself until you change.
Something like
Harping
that.
on something until you change.
Anyway, so maybe that's the connection, but I
Mm-hmm.
just found it fascinating. It's only used about 20 times in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, but in this particular case, it's like there's this. It's looking at what God's done, right? The focus on what God has done, and I think that's pretty crucial because when we focus on what we've done or what someone else has done, usually it leads to bad places. So.
One thing that's kind of interesting about this passage, though, if you look at verses 4-7, it's all about proclamation. One generation shall extol your works, declare your mighty acts, recount the glorious splendor of your majesty, proclaim the might of your deeds, declare your greatness. Sandwiched in the middle is, and on your wondrous works I will meditate.
Complain.
I will complain about your works. Ooh, Exodus, Israel. So I'm kind of curious about that. Why meditate is the choice when everything else is a proclamation? Now, it could be like a chiasm and it's right there in the middle, possibly, I don't know. But I am kind of interested by the fact that meditation is in there when every other statement is a proclamation kind of a statement in this particular passage.
Yeah. What do you think, Todd?
My first reflex tells me that recount is the thing that meditate is in parallel with, and that something about calling to mind the deeds of the past, which is a pretty main feature in the Psalms anyway, but calling to mind the deeds of the past is an intentional effort. If you don't, they can be forgotten or their implications for the present could be lost. And so in this case, complaining, meditating, however we might render this word,
Harping.
harping, yeah, that's what we'll go with.
That's one really stuck.
I do what I can, John.
But it seems like there's the representation of the intentional effort to have to recall and think back.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, the thing we're meditating on in this passage is something external to us.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the object is outside of us. So I don't know if we'll see that pattern or not. I haven't looked ahead.
Same.
Very
may-
spontaneous.
You want to get a few of the passages out there?
Well, the pattern may continue because in Psalm 119, which is the biggie, Psalm 119:48. Does somebody else want to read that? I think we've all got that in front of us.
I
here.
would read it if I was there.
I revere your commandments, which I love, and I will meditate on your statutes. this is an aside. I swear, I almost said, I reserve your commandments and I meditate on your statutes. Both of those are very close for me. Neither of which make any sense, though. But it's moved from God's work more or less in nature, right, in creation, to the specific, the commandments, the Torah, the covenantal expectations. And so now it's still external. It's what God has done or what God has set up, and that is what they're really ruminating on, thinking about.
Yeah, and I think when you said recount, like it's not just count the first time, but count and count and count and count. Recounting, the repetition really stands out. And here, I mean, this psalm it's the longest psalm. Is it the longest chapter in the Bible? I mean,
yes.
It might be the longest chapter.
Maybe
yeah.
not word for word.
It has
but
the
close.
most verses.
Yes,
it has
for
the
sure.
okay,
Which
yeah.
is secondary.
And so, the very fact that almost every single verse is on the law.
Yep.
This isn't
Yeah.
this psalm is an example of repeatedly focusing on one thing. And this verse might be using the word meditate as a part of expressing that.
That's how I read it. Certainly, I see, again, that external being given to us that requires effort theme that I think we discovered in the prior psalm. If we don't think backwards about the wondrous deeds of God, then we risk forgetting them and then risk forgetting or not understanding the implications that they have for the present. And that logic is more or less the same, I think, in this psalm. If we are not meditating, however we are beginning to define this harping word, if we're not meditating on God's commandments, we risk forgetting them. We risk not understanding how they apply to our current circumstances.
Well, in this idea of God's wondrous deeds, it makes me think of Exodus Israel, who are always complaining. And it's like they forgot that this is the God who defeated the Egyptians. This is the God who parted the Red Sea. This is the God who provided them manna and water and quail and all that. And if they would just kept reminding themselves of all the great things God had done, when they would be hungry or thirsty or whatever, they would say, but we know who God is. God's proved himself over and over again. Why would we doubt him now? But it seems that they forget to do that. And as a result, start grumbling and complaining. And Moses gets frustrated and all that.
I mean, you bring up a point that makes me think about the connection of meditating with selective memory. So these Hebrews who come out of Egypt have a very selective memory. Yeah. Remember when we were back in Egypt and we all sat around pots of meat and we ate all day? Like, that never happened, but they say that happened, right?
Right, exactly, yeah.
Meanwhile, they're forgetting, or at least not bringing up these amazing miracles that just brought them out of that land, right? And so I wonder when we talk about, it says meditate on these things, where's the selectivity of it? Is it just those things? Is it the overall what God has done is continuing to do in the world and in the lives of his people? I don't know, but when you meditate on the wrong things, it seems like things go downhill quickly.
Yeah. Well, I think the importance of meditating on God's law, we've seen in, like I said, 119 just talks about that all the time, because it comes back to that selective memory. If you're thinking about the flesh pots of Egypt or thinking about all the bad stuff, that's going to define your current response to everything. But if you're remembering what God did, meditating on it, turning it over and over in your mind, you're like, I know who God is, and I know what he has done. And that means whatever I'm facing now or will face in the future is going to be defined by that knowledge. But it's like you said, Sam, if you're selective and if you're only thinking about what you lost or gave up, now you're going to be frustrated or angry or what kind of God do we serve or whatever.
I can get the last passage on the table here.
Yeah. You want to read that for us?
Sure. This is Joshua 1:8. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. So the book of the law here is the covenant they've made with Moses on the mountain, been handed to the next generation. Meditate on this day and night, which is kind of interesting. Dwell, what's our word? Harp on this all throughout the day.
So, update, different words used here. This is Haggah, which actually has to do with muttering and growling and speaking.
Is that a word used in prophecy contexts?
Don't know.
Okay.
Offhand. But I find that fascinating when you talk about, like you're talking about day and night. So when I hear that word and that definition, I really think of people who are sometimes not necessarily mentally stable, walking around talking to themselves and sort of muttering under their breath and sometimes growling. Like, that's what I think of. I'm not saying that's what this is, but I mean, it's interesting. Like, so when you read the book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth, right? So it's not just in your brain, right? But you shall mutter on it day and night, right? The point is, like, this takes on a physical act. It's not just a mental act. So your definition of thinking, it goes beyond that. It's not just thinking. Now it's reciting. And that's a sort of a different view of meditation that I don't typically have. I'm big on the thinking part of it as opposed to the recitation part of it.
And that was brought up by Ron's verse, locating the Psalm 145:5 in the context of all these other verbal ones. At least in these passages, the thinking and the speaking seem to be not too far from each other.
Right.
Well, I think that makes sense, especially in oral societies where you don't have access to books. I mean, we're sitting here in my office and we're surrounded by books. In all of our offices, we
A little
have these
pretentious.
books. But I kind of like it. I'll take it. But when we have access to the written word, and that's just such a part of our lives, we forget what it's like to live in a culture where you don't have that same kind of access. And I think that's where that muttering part comes in, because especially it's necessary to keep reciting it, to keep it fresh in your memory. If we forget what something looks like in the Bible, we just open the passage and we get a reminder. But these people don't necessarily have such quick access to that. And I think that helps us to understand why the muttering plays such a big part. It's because that's how you keep remembering it and saying it over and over, and it becomes a part of your life. So I love the thinking part of it, but it's like you said, there's more to it than just thinking.
Yeah, and this I don't know, this passage kind of muddies some things for me because I often think of stop and meditate, right? But this is kind of as you're going, meditate.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a complex word.
Yeah. I mean, I think of, like, I tell my Hebrew students, you should always have your vocab cards with you. So when you're in line waiting for food, you flip through your vocab cards. Will you be a weirdo saying it? And yes, but that's how you memorize it, is by constant repetition of it. Even if you're going through your paradigm, yep, people think you're weird when you're sort of muttering under your breath these, Hebrew words, but that's how it gets locked in your brain. And so, like you're saying, it's not just, okay, I'm going into my quiet room and turning off the light and going to be in solitude. It's, you can do this seemingly, or the expectation is you're doing it anytime.
Yeah.
How else do you do it day and night, right? You're at work for 8 to 10 hours a day.
That's funny because I say the exact same thing to the Greek students. Like,
Of course.
I tell them the exact same thing, the same study method. But to what you're saying, John, if I'm, like, right now, I'm out driving a tractor every other day. When I'm on the tractor by myself, I know, the tractor. But if I'm driving, I'm thinking, I'm meditating, I'm running things over in my mind. If I'm working in the garden, I'm planting or pulling weeds or whatever, I'm still working things out in my mind. And so it doesn't require sitting still and like shutting out the world. I think you can be very active doing certain things, but you're allowing your brain to focus on God's word. And it's not just what he said, but how does this apply? How do I apply this in diverse situations and working it over and keeping God's word, in front of us like that? I don't know. I find it, for me, that's relaxing. That's not hard work. That's how I get rest.
Okay, question.
Ready.
So just so we can distinguish some definitions here, right? And you're ultimately going to default to your definition where you land, and we have to apply something, right?
Sure.
But like, say someone who has kind of an obsessive compulsive disorder where they're just focused on the same thing. They can't get it out of their mind. Is that a form of meditation, or is there something about that makes it not meditative?
Well, I think maybe the answer is locked again in our Joshua passage here, where the purpose that's listed for why you would mutter to yourself while you're going about your business is so that you may act in accordance with that shaping force, which is the laws and the statutes. If meditation does not ever lead to action or life change or change in perspective, paradigm shift, whatever it is that you're sort of trying to work through, then it's not necessarily meditation. And we got to be so careful not to be too restrictive. We're not trying to alienate anybody out of their particular meditation practice. But a person who is caught in a cycle that they can't break, trapped in a sense that they can't escape the obsession, that's not resulting in living according to the statutes or making the sort of progress that meditation hopes that a person makes.
So that's not the kind of meditation that the scriptures enjoin us to.
Yeah, and it's Venn diagrams. Meditation does have something to do with fixation. When you have a major decision to make and you're trying to evaluate the commands of God, the wondrous deeds of God in the past in your life and in Israel's life and the church's life, and you're doing all those things, you can get fixated on something that is looming large in your life while you're meditating on it and working your way through a discernment process of trying to make a decision. That is a different thing than being stuck or being trapped by it. And of course, there's lines, there's limits to all of that. Each person is different as well. Some people get so exhausted by that so quickly that they need to do it in small bursts. Sometimes somebody, more of a Ron's personality who's like, I'm just going to live in this until I crack it. And then once it's done, then hopefully it's done and we continue to move forward, just as that moment when I have the opportunity to apply the law that Joshua 1:8 is describing. When that moment has occurred and I have applied the law, I'm now moving past that moment. I'm continuing to meditate on that law and be shaped by its influence so that when new moments come up, I can be the thing that the law is trying to shape me to be. But there is a sense of progress, and that's what meditation needs to be after.
Well, and then Joshua talks about so that you can be prosperous and successful. And if this obsessive behavior is keeping you from being prosperous and successful, then that's probably a good indication that, no, this isn't really meditation. This is something else.
So, all right, so we have three passages here. One is meditating on God's wondrous works. The other two are more like his statutes, his commands, Torah. It's in Sirach, a wisdom book in the Intertestamental literature, meditating upon wisdom, especially the wisdom that comes from God. Do we have, does Christian meditation have to have something of God, right, as its object?
There's sort of a transitive property in play, I think, which is the if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C situation. As far as I've been able to deduce, the Bible does not say you really ought to be meditating about your life circumstances as a means of doing discernment work. That's not like an instruction that we're given. But we do have meditating on the wondrous deeds of Israel, which in the Old Testament tends to function as a category that catches all of those major acts, those national identity-defining acts like rescuing from slavery, delivering from exile, all that stuff, which are also a macrocosm for my micro life that I draw inspiration from. So there's this transitive property thing that's happening. If I'm meditating on God's wondrous deeds, and those wondrous deeds are defined by crossing the Reed Sea or the sort of fantastical things, I also understand those things to be applicable directly to me right now in terms of my ongoing faithfulness to God in the face of an uncertain future. So the transitive property says I can meditate about the things that I'm facing, and in fact am encouraged to do so because God is in them. The encouragement of the scripture is to find God in that lostness and confusion because God's always been there. Here's the proof, all these wondrous deeds. God is here now, and just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there, and meditation in part is about accessing that. This isn't like scripture and verse. Let's go to, Matthew chapter 29, as we joke, the chapter that doesn't exist. Jesus did not say, this is how you use meditation to make decisions. But what Foster is doing, what I'm trying to do with our students, we use meditation in part to make decisions because of the ways that we see the scriptures working in our lives, the way that we see them teaching us to think about God's prior wondrous deeds. And when you put all of that picture together, you wind up with something like, let's think on purpose about God's presence so that we can make good choices. Let's be shaped by God's word and by God's prior activity so that that can influence our decision making.
Yes.
We're all looking at each other. Like, all right, who's going to speak next?
I'm glad that was so insane. Who's going to tell him he's wrong? That's a relief.
You're pulling this together, right? I mean, these people who are recounting salvation history, they are recounting what happened in the lives of real people.
Yeah.
So that's precedent for us recounting our lives, right? Only where we see God at work, right, doing his thing, which would be different than ruminating on our failures.
Sure.
Right? And we're just weighing all the conceptual possibilities. I don't know, that might just be critical thinking and not necessarily meditating on from a Christian perspective on what God has done, is doing, maybe yet to do.
Yeah, and in class I do talk about the pros and cons list. It's not necessarily let's just do the math and figure out what the best decision to make is. Sometimes God's wisdom leads us to make a decision that looks fairly upside down, if I can steal some theological categories, and we discover what that is by meditating on God's word and by meditating on God's activity in the moment to realize God is leading me towards something that does not add up on the pros and cons list.
Because the reality is discernment, critical thinking are based on things you probably already know. Whereas it seems like meditation is expanding what you know by going through these things and making sure they're locked in, right? So when you're recounting what God has done, when you're recounting what God's expectations, Torah, what have you, like you're forming your understanding of that topic, if I can use that, so that other things can happen down the road. But that doesn't seem to be the goal of meditation. The goal of meditation is to set the foundation for other things to build upon. Would that be an appropriate way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think there's two scenarios in mind. There's the everything's fine and I'm doing disciplined upkeep of my spiritual life meditation. And then there's the I'm terrified because I don't know what to do application of meditation. And if you're doing the first one, then the second one ends up being an awful lot easier. And if you do the second one responding in an emergency, hopefully you'll realize the value of this exercise and continue doing it after the emergency has ended.
Yeah. Well, we're close to wrapping up. Is there some things you want to say about people who have listened to this? They've kind of wrestled with it a little bit. Do you want to give any practical advice for how someone is like, yeah, I want to spend more time meditating. I want to cultivate this discipline. We can turn it over to you to wrap up and say what you think this should maybe look like in practice.
Yeah, I do. I hope to have some really practical advice here. If you're trying to meditate, if that's the goal that you've set out with and you're making an attempt to meditate, you are. Like, take the pressure off yourself. Stop making it an esoteric flight into the cosmic consciousness, something that's so confusing or unattainable or hard to reach. It's not. You probably do this already. You probably already have this worked into your routines in some way, like driving home from work and suddenly you're home and you weren't thinking about what turns you were making to get there. You were just thinking about your day and all that. That's meditation in its own way. And so if you're trying to meditate, you are. And if you're looking for something like a specific practice where you say, okay, I think I understand what Todd's saying. I get it. Meditation's part of my world, but I want to just sit down and I want to do it. Then I would suggest looking into some kind of mindfulness exercise, some way of getting in touch more with what your body is doing and feeling in the space that you're in, becoming aware of your surroundings. Because if we really believe, and I think we do, if we really believe that God is at work in and around us all the time, then part of meditation as well could be about just slowing down long enough to recognize God's activity that's already ongoing. And mindfulness is a way to do that. And I know that mindfulness is a loaded word as well. I accuse the church of kind of adopting the self-help stuff from 50 years ago. We run the risk of doing that again with mindfulness, which was kind of in vogue and the hotness for the last 10 years or so. But what mindfulness is pointing to is an increased level of awareness that cuts through the busyness of life, the kinds of routines that absorb us and trap us into a lack of awareness. Cutting through that on purpose is an act of meditation and a great place to begin. A great place to begin as we're trying to meditate on God's word or trying to meditate even just on how do I feel about getting passed over for that promotion at work or whatever the case may be.
So do you find like breathing exercises helpful?
If you're asking me personally, this is a little bit of the Ron territory. That comes really naturally to me, doing some sports that involved some breathing stuff that was important. So no, if you're asking me. Would the average person who's trying to do this? I'd say, yeah, definitely. You should try that. What your body is doing is a more complicated question than you think. Like meditating on how you feel about how you're seated. Do you have any weird pressure on your feet, on your back, on where you're sitting? Do you have just thinking about the awareness of you being an embodied person and having an experience of living in three-dimensional space? That's a more complex question than we give it credit for. So if you start that by saying, how's my breathing? Am I getting enough air? Am I comfortable? Am I, just start basic and work your way into other things. I think that's a great way to just kind of entry level, like, let me try this out and see what God can do with something so simple.
Ultimately, work yourself towards psychedelics.
That's what I heard.
The views and opinions expressed on the After Class podcast.
Just kidding. Well, thanks so much, Todd. I think you did a great job kicking us off, carrying this theme.
Fine work.
Good
We
job.
might have you back next week.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the plan. Foster has 13 different practices and disciplines, he calls them. And so we're going to make our way through them. And unless Todd gets so busy, he's like, I need to take a break because, he has a full-time job, turns out.
Unlike
And,
us.
I know. I like it. Sit around all day meditating.
We're doing some repeat teaching. He's
Yeah,
doing some new
that's
course
fair.
creation, so we're trying to be respectful of his
Yeah.
time. But anyway, thank you for joining us for this episode of the After Class Podcast.
After class, because
The best conversations happen.
After class.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of the After Class Podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio editing and mixing is done by Drew Nyquist. Episode images and descriptions are provided by Darren Harris.